I knew my marriage was over the moment I heard my husband laugh. It wasn't the laugh itself. It was the softness in it. The intimacy, the version of him I hadn't heard in months. I was standing in the hallway outside his home office, a folded stack of laundry pressed against my chest, when his voice drifted through the barely closed door. "She signed everything. She never reads the fine print," he said, low and confident. "By the time she files for divorce, the funds will be outside U.S. jurisdiction. Christmas will be her last holiday in that house." My heart didn't race. It didn't shatter. It went still. Then he added something colder. "The amendment to the family will is done. She's officially excluded." I didn't breathe. I didn't cry. I didn't push the door open. I just listened. "She has no idea the international transfer already cleared," he continued. "Vancouver's clean. Once the Canadian structure finalizes, she won't touch a dime." The word Vancouver echoed in my head. This wasn't an affair. This wasn't a midlife crisis. This was financial erasure. I stepped back silently before the floorboard beneath me could creak. I carried the laundry upstairs, placed it neatly on the bed, and sat down. My name is Rebecca. I was 34 years old at the time, a personal financial advisor based in Seattle. I built retirement plans, structured portfolios, and taught clients how to protect themselves from risk they couldn't see. Apparently, I had married one. Brian and I had what people like to call a modern marriage. He was 37, a freelance web developer who worked remotely. I handled long-term investment strategy for clients. We split responsibilities. We had joint brokerage accounts, shared retirement contributions, a carefully diversified portfolio. We lived in Magnolia, in a home we had renovated together. Every Thanksgiving we drove down to Portland to see his parents at their timber estate outside Lake Oswego. Every Christmas, we hosted friends. On paper, it looked stable, but stability is often just good bookkeeping. The first signs had been subtle. Brian had started taking late-night European client calls. "Berlin," he said. "Amsterdam. Sometimes Paris." The time zones never quite matched what I knew about European business hours. But I hadn't pressed him. Freelance tech work was global. I wanted to be supportive. Then he began locking his office door during calls. Then he stopped discussing long-term financial planning with me. That was the real shift. We used to sit at the kitchen island on Sunday nights reviewing our asset allocations. We would talk about projected returns, tax efficiency, even estate planning. 3 months ago, he began saying, "I've got it handled." Handled. That word should have alarmed me. The week before I overheard the call, I had noticed one of our joint liquidity funds had been reclassified under something labeled temporary international deployment. It was a small percentage, enough to move unnoticed by someone who didn't look carefully. I looked carefully. Still, I didn't confront him. And now I knew why. I went to my office the next morning as usual. I reviewed client portfolios. I adjusted a retirement distribution plan for a couple in Bellevue. I answered emails. At lunch, I logged into our shared investment dashboard. The transfer he mentioned had cleared the previous evening at 8:43 Pacific time. European business hours would have been long closed. I opened our home network log history. I had access through the router dashboard because I had installed it. The outgoing encrypted data packet that night had been routed through a VPN endpoint registered in British Columbia. Vancouver, not Paris. I pulled up the transfer details. The beneficiary institution was a financial entity in Vancouver operating under a numbered holding company. I searched the Canadian corporate registry. The company had been formed 3 months earlier. Director, Brittany Cole. 33, digital marketing consultant. I leaned back in my chair. The name sounded familiar. Then I remembered, 3 months ago, Brian had mentioned collaborating with a cross-border marketing strategist for one of his web clients. He had described her as sharp, international, strategic. He hadn't described her as the recipient of our money. I kept digging. The holding company had received 2 consulting payments from Brian's LLC before the large transfer. The timing aligned perfectly with the nights he claimed he was debugging code. I checked our joint mortgage documents next. 3 weeks earlier, our home equity line had been converted into a liquidity facility. Both of our digital signatures appeared on the authorization. I had never signed it. The IP address attached to my signature was not our home network. I closed the browser and stared at the skyline beyond my office window. Brian thought I had signed something without reading it. That assumption told me more than any confession could. 3 years ago, when his freelance income surged and his father suggested we draft a post-nuptial agreement to protect the family business, I had agreed. I had also added a clause. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just precise. A fraud and concealment asset reversal provision. It covered undisclosed transfers, foreign holdings, pre-divorce repositioning, and financial benefit tied to extramarital relationships. He had signed it quickly. He had never asked questions. That night, after overhearing him, I didn't confront him when he came to bed. He slipped under the covers and kissed my shoulder like nothing had shifted. "Long day?" he asked. "Productive," I said. He fell asleep within minutes. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He believed I didn't read the fine print. What he didn't know was that I had written it. The morning after I heard everything, I made coffee the same way I always did. Brian sat at the kitchen island scrolling through his phone, looking relaxed, almost cheerful. He kissed my cheek and said he had another late European client call that evening. "Berlin this time," he added casually. I nodded and stirred my coffee slowly. Berlin, 8:43 Pacific time. I left for work as usual, my heels clicking against the hardwood floors of our Magnolia home. The air outside was sharp and cold, but my mind felt unnervingly clear. At my office downtown, I closed my door before logging into our joint financial dashboard. I started with timestamps. The wire transfer Brian mentioned had cleared at 8:43 in the evening. I pulled up historical global market schedules on a secondary screen. Berlin would have been well past business hours. London, too. British Columbia, however, would have been open. I opened our home network logs. I had administrative access because I insisted on setting up our digital infrastructure when we moved in. The outgoing encrypted packet from the night of his call was routed through a VPN endpoint registered in Vancouver. Not Paris. Not Berlin. Vancouver. I searched the beneficiary institution from the wire details. It was a private financial entity in British Columbia operating under a numbered holding structure. Then I searched the Canadian corporate registry. The holding company had been formed 3 months earlier. Director. Brittany Cole. My stomach didn't drop. It tightened. Brittany Cole. 33. Digital marketing consultant. Cross-border expansion specialist. Her LinkedIn profile emphasized offshore brand scaling, tax-optimized structures, and international relocation consulting. She had relocated from California to Vancouver 2 years earlier. I kept scrolling. 2 consulting payments from Brian's LLC had been routed to that same holding company before the larger transfer cleared. The descriptions were vague, strategic advisory and market research. The dates matched the nights Brian claimed he was debugging code. I opened the metadata of our joint brokerage account next. A portion of our high-yield liquidity fund had been reclassified under temporary international deployment. It was structured in a way that would not trigger obvious alarms for someone casually reviewing the portfolio. But I don't review casually. The authorization document showed both of our digital signatures. I pulled the embedded signature data. The IP address associated with my signature was not our home network. It was not my office. It was not any device I owned. It was an external source. I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands. Brian hadn't just moved money. He had leveraged marital property. I logged into our mortgage portal. 3 weeks earlier, our home equity line had been converted into a short-term liquidity facility. The converted amount aligned almost perfectly with the large Vancouver transfer. Our house had funded his relocation plan. I checked my credit monitoring dashboard next. There it was. A hard inquiry initiated by a Canadian financial institution in British Columbia. Reference. Investment visa evaluation. The date aligned exactly with one of his so-called European calls. He wasn't just repositioning money. He was positioning himself. That evening, Brian returned home carrying takeout from my favorite Thai place. He set the bags on the counter and smiled as if nothing had changed. "Figured we could have an easy night," he said. I watched him unpack the containers carefully. "How was Berlin?" I asked. He didn't look up. "Productive." "What time did you finish?" "Late." "Their mornings overlap weirdly." I nodded. He believed I wouldn't check. After dinner, he retreated to his office again, locking the door behind him. I opened my laptop at the kitchen table and searched Brittany's litigation history. There it was. A civil complaint filed in California 2 years ago by a startup founder alleging that she had assisted in repositioning assets prior to a divorce filing. The case had been dismissed on procedural grounds. Dismissed did not mean disproven. I searched property records. 3 months ago, Brittany had been physically present in Seattle. A social media photo, archived by a third-party aggregator, showed her tagged 2 blocks from my house. The timestamp was from a Tuesday afternoon. Brian had told me he was working from home that day. I closed my laptop slowly. This wasn't an impulsive affair. It wasn't emotional recklessness. It was a timeline. Company formation. Liquidity conversion. Cross-border transfer. Immigration credit inquiry. Trust amendment. I opened our shared Google Calendar. There it was. January 3rd. Consult BC Immigration Pathway. Not a conference. Not a client meeting. An immigration consultation. I felt something shift inside me then, not panic, not heartbreak, but alignment. Brian believed he would file for divorce after securing his relocation capital. He believed jurisdiction would weaken once assets crossed borders. He believed I would be left navigating paperwork too late to matter. He underestimated documentation. He underestimated timing. I opened a new email and typed a name I trusted professionally. Daniel Mercer. Forensic accountant. Subject line. Consultation, International Asset Exposure Risk. I kept the message neutral. No accusations. No names. Just facts. Cross-border transfers tied to marital property. Liquidity restructuring. Potential concealment prior to separation. I hit send. Upstairs. Brian laughed softly into his headset. I listened to the sound float down the hallway. Calm and confident. He thought geography would protect him. He didn't realize that patterns protect me. I remembered the exact conference room where Brian signed the agreement. It had been 3 years earlier. In a polished glass office overlooking Elliott Bay, his father had arranged the meeting, calling it a simple precaution. The timber holdings were expanding. Brian's freelance income was growing. They wanted everything clean, structured, protected, just to keep things organized, his father had said, smiling in that careful way he did when money was involved. The attorney had presented a standard post-nuptial agreement. It focused primarily on protecting inherited assets and shielding the family business from marital division. It was tidy, conservative, predictable. I had read every line, and then I had asked for revisions. Brian remembered that day as routine. I remembered it as negotiation. If we're protecting inherited assets, I said back then, we should also protect against concealment. On either side. The attorney hesitated. Brian shrugged and said, "Sure, fair is fair." So I added a clause. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't accuse. It didn't imply mistrust. It was simply titled, Fraud and Concealment Asset Reversal Provision. It covered undisclosed transfers of marital assets. It covered cross-border repositioning of funds. It covered financial benefit derived from extramarital relationships when tied to concealment. It covered pre-divorce shielding. And most importantly, it did not require proof of physical infidelity. It required proof of financial deception. Brian had skimmed it. I had watched his eyes move across the page without stopping. He signed. So did I. Now, sitting in my office 3 years later, I opened my encrypted archive and pulled up the executed agreement. The clause was still there, fully enforceable. Legally binding. I scrolled to the renewal addendum. 6 months earlier, Brian had casually asked whether we needed to refresh any of our legal paperwork. Probably not, he had said. It's just formalities. I had renewed it anyway. Digitally. Quietly. Properly filed. The confirmation email sat in my secure folder. Time-stamped and notarized. Brian believed the clause expired automatically after 2 years unless re-notarized. He was wrong. I picked up my phone and called Daniel. We met that afternoon in his downtown office. Daniel Mercer had built his reputation unraveling financial structures people thought were invisible. I need a hypothetical opinion, I said. He smiled slightly. They're never hypothetical. I outlined the scenario without names. Cross-border transfers. Mortgage collateral conversion. Holding company formed months before suspected separation. Immigration investment verification. Daniel leaned back in his chair. If the funds originated from marital assets and were repositioned in anticipation of divorce without disclosure, he said carefully, you're looking at concealment behavior. Not automatically criminal, but civilly significant. And if the funds cross into a Canadian holding structure, recovery becomes more complex, he replied. Unless you act before relocation finalizes. Before relocation finalizes. I asked him about timing. He asked for documentation. I gave him limited access to specific transfer records. He studied them silently. The pattern suggests urgency, he said finally. Like someone believes a clock is ticking. It was that evening. I researched the family trust amendment Brian mentioned during his call. Public probate filings showed a pending modification submitted by his father 2 weeks after the first Vancouver transfer. The amendment created a discretionary subfund under the trust umbrella. The language was vague, but one phrase caught my attention. International strategic allocation. I closed my laptop and stared at the ceiling. If Brian was removed from the primary trust distribution schedule and compensated instead through foreign structures, it could bypass marital division claims tied to inheritance. Unless concealment could be proven. I opened the agreement again and read the clause slowly. Concealment includes intentional failure to disclose transfer of marital assets to foreign entities for purposes of shielding division. Clear. Direct. Enforceable. I remembered the night Brian asked whether we still needed that paperwork. He had been distracted, almost impatient. We're fine, he said. It's just legal noise. Legal noise. Upstairs. He was on another European call. I walked quietly to the hallway and paused again outside his office door. I told you, he was saying softly. The clause doesn't apply anymore. She doesn't even remember what's in it. My lips curved slightly. He had never asked what I remembered. Back downstairs, I opened our shared airline account. January 3rd. One-way ticket to Vancouver. Departure. 7:15 in the morning. No return flight scheduled. I opened our shared calendar. BC immigration consultation. 2 days before the flight, he wasn't planning a temporary expansion. He was planning departure. I sat at the kitchen island and began creating a new folder on my laptop. Evidence. Transfers. Mortgage restructuring. Corporate registry. Trust amendment. Immigration inquiry. I organized everything chronologically. When Brian came down for water later that night, he looked at me curiously. You're working late, he said. Always, I replied. He poured himself a glass and leaned against the counter. You trust me, right? He asked casually. I looked up at him, studying his face. Yes, I said evenly. I trust documentation. He laughed lightly. Not understanding? When he went back upstairs, I printed a clean copy of the fraud and concealment clause and placed it in a separate envelope. He believed the clause was dead. What he didn't realize was that it had just become the most important document in our marriage. Brittany wasn't just a woman on the other end of a late-night call. She was a strategist. I sat in my car outside a cafe near Pioneer Square, tablet balanced on the steering wheel, reviewing everything I could find about her. The rain streaked down the windshield in thin lines, blurring the city into gray motion. Inside the car, everything felt sharp. If this had only been infidelity, I might have confronted Brian already. I might have screamed. I might have demanded answers. But this wasn't just betrayal. This was architecture. Brittany Cole's professional profile read like a relocation blueprint. Cross-border expansion, offshore brand scaling, tax-efficient international positioning. She had moved from San Diego to Vancouver 2 years earlier, and her client list included startups shifting operations north for strategic regulatory advantages. Regulatory advantages. I searched litigation databases again, digging deeper this time. 2 years ago, a tech founder in California had filed a civil complaint alleging she helped him restructure assets in anticipation of marital dissolution. The case had been dismissed on procedural grounds. The court never reached the merits. Dismissed didn't mean innocent. I checked corporate filings for the Vancouver holding company. It had been formed 3 months earlier. Director: Brittany Cole. Registered address: a downtown Vancouver business tower. I cross-referenced domain registrations tied to Brian's freelance web projects. One of his recent hosting accounts listed billing through an entity connected to Brittany's holding company. The domain metadata showed coordination weeks before the first large wire transfer. This wasn't spontaneous. It was planned. Back at my office, I accessed archived logs from our home router again. There had been an encrypted email sent the night Brian mentioned pre-divorce positioning. The subject line wasn't visible, but the attachment name had been Trust Bypass _outline. PDF. Trust Bypass. I stared at the file name. This wasn't just about moving money. It was about redirecting inheritance streams through foreign structures before divorce filings could touch them. My phone buzzed suddenly. Unknown number. The message was short. Stop digging. You don't understand how far this goes. I didn't respond. Instead, I ran a reverse lookup on the number. Prepaid Canadian carrier. British Columbia. Call history showed that same number had contacted Brian the previous week. They were nervous. Good. That evening, I reviewed public filings related to Brian's family timber holdings in Oregon. The trust controlled significant acreage and property management assets. It had been stable for decades. But 3 months ago, an internal restructuring had converted a portion of long-term timber reserves into liquid capital. The timing aligned perfectly with the formation of Brittany's holding company. Liquid reserves are easier to move. I felt something tighten in my chest, not jealousy, not heartbreak, but recognition. If the trust was being partially liquefied to support Brian's relocation capital, then this wasn't just a husband and a mistress. This was a coordinated maneuver. Later that night, I met with Laura, my family law attorney. Her office was quiet, warm, and discreet. I need to understand the exposure, I told her. I outlined everything: offshore holding structure, mortgage line conversion, trust amendment, immigration inquiry. Laura listened without interrupting. If marital assets were repositioned in anticipation of divorce, she said carefully, that strengthens your case significantly. If third parties assisted knowingly, they could be subpoenaed. And the trust, I asked, if it's entangled with marital property or used to indirectly shield assets, it's not untouchable. Not untouchable. That was the first time I felt the balance shift. I left her office and checked our shared airline account again. January 3rd. One-way ticket to Vancouver. No return. I opened Brittany's social media again. Most of her recent activity was business-focused. Neutral. Professional. But 3 months earlier, there was a photo, archived, but still retrievable, taken in Seattle. Location tag: Magnolia. 2 blocks from my house. The timestamp matched a Tuesday afternoon Brian had told me he was working from home. The photo caption read, Strategic planning session. Big things ahead. Big things. I closed my laptop and sat in the quiet of our living room that night. Brian was upstairs on another call. I could hear the faint murmur of his voice through the ceiling. He believed I was naive. He believed I saw only what he chose to show me. He believed Brittany was an advantage. What he didn't understand was that alliances built on concealment fracture under pressure. I opened a secure folder labeled Evidence and began organizing everything in sequence. Company formation, consulting payments, mortgage restructuring, trust amendment, immigration inquiry, anonymous warning text. The pattern wasn't emotional, it was procedural. And procedures leave trails. When Brian came downstairs later that night, he looked at me curiously. "You've been quiet lately," he said. "I've been busy," I replied. He studied my face as if trying to read something there. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yes," I said evenly. "Everything's becoming very clear." He smiled, misinterpreting my calm. "Upstairs." I heard him lock his office door again. I didn't need to listen anymore. Brittany wasn't just a mistress. She was a financial architect helping my husband build an escape. What neither of them realized was that every structure they built had a foundation. And foundations can be examined. The first time Brian lied directly to my face. It wasn't about Brittany. It was about Thanksgiving. We were sitting at the kitchen island reviewing travel plans to his parents' estate outside Lake Oswego. His mother had already texted about seating arrangements and dessert assignments. Everything felt routine, almost comfortingly normal. "I might fly up to Vancouver for a couple of days before we drive down to Oregon," he said casually, scrolling through his phone. "Client thing? Quick turnaround. Vancouver." I looked up slowly. "Before Thanksgiving." "Yeah," he said. "It's just business. You know how these cross-border deals are?" "Cross-border deals." I nodded and returned to my laptop. What he didn't know was that Laura had already drafted a quiet notice of financial inquiry. Not a divorce filing. Not yet. Just a preservation request, filed under seal with King County Superior Court to document suspected concealment activity if Brian attempted to finalize relocation before Thanksgiving. The timing would matter. That night, I accessed our joint credit profile again. Another hard inquiry. This time tied to a Canadian residential lease application. Lease start date? December 1st. I felt something cold settle into place. He wasn't planning to surprise me with a conversation. He was planning to leave. The next morning, Daniel called. "I ran the partial transaction review you sent," he said. "There's layering happening." "Layering," I repeated. "Funds moved from your joint liquidity account into his LLC, from the LLC into the Vancouver holding company. Then a portion was transferred into a secondary account flagged as strategic consulting fees." "And the source?" I asked. "Your home equity line." I closed my eyes briefly. "Our house." "Timing?" I asked. "Accelerated," he said. "Transfers increased frequency after the immigration inquiry. They were racing a clock." That afternoon, I drove to Portland alone. I told Brian I wanted to help his mother with holiday prep early. He seemed relieved, almost distracted. His parents' estate sat on wooded acreage outside Lake Oswego, the timber fields stretching beyond the back fence like quiet witnesses. His father greeted me warmly. "Brian coming up later?" he asked. "He might," I replied carefully. "Depends on his schedule." I spent the afternoon reviewing estate paperwork under the guise of helping his mother organize holiday documents. She trusted me. She always had. In a leather-bound folder inside the study, I found the trust amendment. It had been executed 2 weeks after the first Vancouver transfer. The amendment created a discretionary allocation channel for international strategic opportunities. It allowed distributions to bypass standard beneficiary sequencing under specific business expansion circumstances. Brian had signed as a participating beneficiary. The language was broad, but it required full disclosure of marital financial standing if distributions were tied to relocation. Disclosure he had not made. I photographed the relevant pages discreetly. That evening, I walked the perimeter of the property alone. The air smelled like wet cedar. For years, I had imagined raising children there during holidays, watching them run between trees that had been in Brian's family for generations. Now I saw something else. Leverage. When I returned to Seattle the next day, Brian was packing a carry-on suitcase. Last-minute trip, he said lightly. Back in 2 days? To Berlin? I asked. He hesitated just a fraction. Yeah, Berlin. I smiled softly. His flight confirmation sat open on his laptop on the desk behind him. Departure. Seattle to Vancouver. I didn't point it out. Instead, I said, travel safe. After he left, I logged into our shared device history. His laptop had synced automatically with our home cloud. The most recent document he accessed was titled Divorce Timeline, Phase 2. Phase 2. I opened it. Bullet points. Finalize offshore liquidity. Secure Vancouver residence. Amend trust allocation. Initiate separation conversation post-holiday. It was clinical. Efficient. At the bottom of the document was a line that made my stomach tighten. Ensure Rebecca remains unaware until relocation final. Remain unaware. I forwarded the document to Laura and Daniel immediately. Then I opened a new folder labeled Countermeasure. If he believed Phase 2 was imminent, he wouldn't expect resistance yet. That gave me a window. I drafted a preliminary motion to freeze marital assets under suspicion of concealment. Laura reviewed and adjusted it carefully. We didn't file it yet. Timing mattered. If filed too early, he could accelerate relocation. If filed too late, funds could disperse further. I checked the Canadian lease start date again. December 1st. Thanksgiving was 1 week away. That evening, Brian texted from Vancouver. Meeting went great. Might expand contract. I responded with a simple thumbs-up emoji. He followed with another message. Love you. I stared at the words for a long moment. Love had become logistics. Trust had become strategy. And Thanksgiving was no longer just a holiday. It was a deadline. I closed my laptop and looked around the house we had built together. He believed he was 1 step ahead. He didn't realize that I had already begun drafting Phase 3. Brian came back from Vancouver smiling. He rolled his suitcase into the hallway like someone returning from a successful business trip. Not someone rehearsing an exit strategy. Contracts moving forward? He said, hanging his coat. It's big. Could change everything. I watched him carefully. Change everything how? I asked. International expansion, he said lightly. More flexibility. Maybe even relocation opportunities down the line. Relocation opportunities. I nodded as if the idea were new. That night, after he fell asleep, I opened the countermeasure folder again. Laura had finalized the emergency petition draft to preserve marital assets under suspicion of fraudulent concealment. The motion referenced the fraud and concealment asset reversal provision from our post-nuptial agreement. It cited suspicious transfers, mortgage liquidity conversion, and cross-border repositioning. We hadn't filed it yet, because timing was everything. Daniel called the next morning. There's something else, he said. A secondary account opened in Brian's name through a Vancouver institution. It's not directly tied to your joint funds, but seed capital originated from the same liquidity line. How much? I asked. Enough to qualify for a provincial investor pathway. Investor pathway. Immigration wasn't hypothetical anymore. Is the account active? I asked. Yes. And there's a scheduled transfer set for December 2nd. December 2nd. 2 days after the Canadian lease began, 2 days after Thanksgiving weekend. I felt the window narrowing. That afternoon, I reviewed our shared brokerage dashboard again. A new request had been initiated, pending authorization, for partial liquidation of long-term index holdings. The request required dual authentication. My phone buzzed. Brian. Hey, he said casually. Quick thing. I'm adjusting our portfolio slightly. Just authorize the notification you get. What's it for? I asked. Tax optimization. He replied smoothly. Year-end stuff. Tax optimization. I opened the pending request while he was still on the phone. Liquidation amount. Significant. Destination. Brian LLC operational account. I kept my voice even. Send me the tax analysis summary, I said. There was a brief pause. I'll forward it later, he said. I'll wait. I replied gently. Silence stretched between us. Fine, he said finally. We'll review it together tonight. He ended the call. He hadn't expected resistance. That evening, he tried again. We need liquidity for expansion, he said, sitting across from me at the kitchen island. It's temporary. Expansion where? I asked calmly. He held my gaze for a moment. International markets. Canada, I asked softly. He blinked. Why Canada? Just curious, I said. He forced a smile. You've been digging lately, he said lightly. I'm a financial advisor, I replied. Digging is part of the job. He laughed. But it didn't reach his eyes. Later that night, I received another message from the same unknown Canadian number. You're making this harder than it needs to be. No signature. No explanation. But the implication was clear. They believed I was interfering. I forwarded the message to Laura. Good, she said when I called her. Pressure makes people sloppy. Sloppy was exactly what I needed. The next morning, I drove to King County Superior Court. Laura met me outside. We filed today, she said quietly. Not the divorce. The preservation order. My pulse stayed steady. If he attempts the December transfer, this freezes everything, she continued. Joint accounts. Business accounts tied to marital funds. Even secondary holdings once identified. And the trust? I asked. If we can demonstrate concealment intent, we can request disclosure under oath. Under oath. Brian believed he was preparing Phase 2. He didn't realize Phase 0 had just been activated. We filed the petition under seal. No notification yet. That would come with service. That evening, Brian came home holding a bottle of wine. Thought we could relax, he said. I watched him pour 2 glasses. Do you ever think about starting over somewhere new? He asked suddenly. Sometimes, I said. Canada's beautiful, he continued. Vancouver especially. I held his gaze. Are you planning to move there? I asked. He hesitated, then laughed softly. Just thinking out loud. Just thinking. Upstairs. I heard his phone vibrate repeatedly. He excused himself and closed the office door. I walked quietly to the hallway again. You need to accelerate, a woman's voice said faintly through the door. Brittany. She's asking questions, she continued. If she files before the final transfer, she won't, Brian said firmly. She trusts me. I stepped back slowly. Trust. He was still operating under that assumption. Back downstairs? I opened the confirmation email from the court. Petition received. Pending judicial review. If granted before December 2nd. The scheduled transfer would trigger automatic freeze protocols. Brian returned to the living room minutes later, smiling again. Everything good? He asked. Yes, I said softly. Everything's about to be. He didn't understand the difference between calm and surrender. He believed I was behind him in the timeline. What he didn't know was that I had just moved the clock forward. The judge signed the preservation order on a gray Tuesday morning. Laura called me at 10:12. It's granted, she said. Temporary asset freeze pending evidentiary review. Service needs to happen before the December transfer executes. December 2nd was 5 days away. Can we control timing? I asked. Yes, she replied. But once he's served, the clock starts on disclosure obligations. Disclosure obligations. Brian had always believed paperwork was a formality, a technicality, something people skimmed. Now it was about to become his problem. We decided to serve him on Thanksgiving. Public. Controlled. Impossible to ignore. That afternoon, Daniel forwarded updated transaction alerts. The December 2nd transfer was just rescheduled, he said. Now set for November 29th. 2 days earlier. The day after Thanksgiving. They were accelerating. I felt something cold and precise settle into place. They know something, Daniel added. Or they're nervous. Good. I drove home carefully, rehearsing nothing. Brian was in the kitchen when I walked in, chopping vegetables like a man planning dinner. Not an escape? Mom says Brittany might join Thanksgiving, he said casually, not looking up. She's in town for meetings. My hand stilled on my bag strap. Brittany? I asked evenly. Yeah, he said. Potential business partner? Dad wants to meet her. Dad wants to meet her. So this wasn't just relocation. It was integration. Of course, I said calmly. The more the merrier, he smiled. Relieved. He thought he controlled the narrative. That night, I reviewed the service plan with Laura. A licensed process server would be present in Portland on Thanksgiving morning. Discreet. Efficient. He would wait until Brian was physically present at the estate before initiating service. That prevents him from accelerating anything immediately. Laura said. Bank freezes trigger upon service confirmation. And the trust? I asked. We've attached the concealment clause. If the judge sees evidence of pre-divorce repositioning tied to extramarital collaboration, distribution modifications can be scrutinized. Scrutinized. I slept deeply that night for the first time in weeks. Thanksgiving morning arrived cold and bright. We drove to Lake Oswego together. Brian was relaxed, humming softly to music on the radio. You seem calm, he said, glancing at me. I replied. The estate was already busy when we arrived. His mother greeted us warmly. His father shook my hand a fraction too firmly. Brittany arrived 20 minutes later. She was polished, confident, wearing a tailored coat that probably cost more than my first car. Rebecca, she said smoothly, extending her hand. I've heard so much about you. I'm sure you have, I replied, holding her gaze just long enough. Brian hovered near her, protective but casual. Dinner preparation moved forward. Turkey roasting. Wine poured. Laughter echoing through the timber-framed dining hall. On the surface, it was perfect. At 11:45, Brian stepped outside to take a call. The process server approached him at the edge of the gravel driveway. I watched through the window. The exchange was brief. A folder handed over. A signature requested. Brian's face changed slowly as he scanned the first page. He looked toward the house instinctively. Our eyes met through the glass. He walked back inside. Pale. What is this? His father asked immediately. Brian's voice shook slightly. Preservation order, he said. Temporary asset freeze. Silence fell across the room. What assets? His mother whispered. I stood slowly. Marital assets, I said calmly. And any related structures involving concealment. Brittany's posture stiffened. This is unnecessary, she said sharply. There's no wrongdoing. Then disclosure will be simple, I replied. Brian stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. You filed this? He asked. Yes. When? He demanded. Before the transfer was accelerated, I said softly. His father looked at him sharply. What transfer? He asked. Brian didn't answer. His phone buzzed loudly in his hand. He looked down. Notification. Transaction blocked. Pending legal review. Another buzz. Joint brokerage account frozen. Another LLC operating account under review. Brittany's phone vibrated seconds later. Her expression shifted from confidence to calculation. This isn't over, she said quietly. No, I agreed. It's just beginning. Dinner was never served. Brian stepped outside again, pacing along the gravel driveway, calling someone urgently. I could hear fragments of panic through the open door. They froze it. No. The whole thing, yes. She filed. Inside. His father turned to me. Rebecca, he said slowly. What's happening? I met his gaze evenly. Your son attempted to reposition marital funds internationally prior to initiating divorce proceedings, I said. Under our agreement. That triggers reversal and full disclosure. Brittany moved toward the door. This is harassment, she said. You're overreacting. I smiled slightly. I haven't reacted yet. Brian came back inside minutes later. What do you want? He asked. Anger replacing shock. Transparency, I replied. He stared at me, breathing hard. You blindsided me, he said. No, I answered calmly. I documented you. Outside. Wind moved through the timber trees. Inside. Every account he had tried to secure was now frozen. He had planned Thanksgiving as his final quiet holiday before departure. Instead, it became the moment everything stopped. He thought he was executing Phase 2. He never realized I had already closed the exit. Brian did not sleep that night. I could hear him pacing in the guest room down the hall of his parents' estate. Floorboards creaking under the weight of a plan collapsing in real time. Thanksgiving had ended in silence. No pie, no speeches. Just lawyers' names exchanged in tense whispers, and Brittany leaving before sunset without saying goodbye. By 8 a.m, Brian's phone was vibrating nonstop. Bank notifications. Email alerts. His Vancouver institution had formally acknowledged receipt of the preservation order. The scheduled November 29th transfer was now suspended pending judicial clarification. He walked into the kitchen where I was sitting with coffee and stared at me like I had become someone unrecognizable. You didn't have to do this publicly, he said. You didn't have to do it secretly, I replied. His father entered the room moments later, holding a printed copy of the trust amendment. Explain this, he demanded, voice low and controlled. Brian looked cornered. It was just strategic planning, he muttered. Strategic for what? His father pressed. Relocation. Divorce. Brian's silence answered. I stood slowly. The trust modification was executed 2 weeks after he initiated cross-border transfers from our joint liquidity fund, I said evenly. The amendment allows discretionary allocation to international structures without standard marital disclosure. His mother gasped softly. That's not what we agreed to, his father said sharply. Brian ran a hand through his hair. You're overcomplicating this. He snapped at me. This was temporary. Temporary doesn't require concealment, I said. His phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a notification. It was Brittany. He stepped outside to answer. Through the glass door. I watched his posture shift, defensive, then frustrated. When he came back in, his expression was tight. She's being dragged into this, he said accusingly. You subpoenaed her. Yes, I said calmly. Forensic review includes third-party collaboration tied to marital funds. You're ruining her career, he shot back. I held his gaze. You involved her in our marriage. Silence pressed against the walls. His father folded his arms. How much did you move? He asked bluntly. Brian hesitated. Enough, I answered for him. Enough to qualify for an investor immigration pathway in British Columbia. His mother sank into a chair. You were leaving? She whispered. Brian didn't respond. That afternoon, Laura called with updates. The judge has scheduled a preliminary evidentiary hearing in 2 weeks, she said. All international holdings must be disclosed within 10 days. Failure to comply strengthens concealment claims. Can he move funds elsewhere? I asked. Not without violating the order, she replied. And violation carries penalties. Penalties. When Brian returned to Seattle with me that evening, the house felt different. Not broken. Exposed. He moved through the rooms like someone walking through a place he no longer owned. You could have just talked to me, he said finally. I was listening, I replied. He laughed bitterly. You think this is revenge? No, I said quietly. This is documentation. That night, I logged into our brokerage account again. The freeze was complete. Joint accounts locked. LLC operating account under judicial review. Secondary Vancouver account flagged. The December 2nd transfer had been officially canceled. Brian stood in the doorway of my office. They'll fight this, he said. International law isn't simple. I know, I replied. And if the trust protects distributions, he pushed. It won't protect concealment, I said. He studied me carefully. You've been planning this, he said. No, I answered. I've been observing. The next morning, Brittany sent me a direct email. Subject: Let's be adults. I opened it calmly. She claimed their relationship had been purely strategic at first. She framed the relocation as a business necessity. She insisted Brian had told her the post-nuptial clause had expired. I replied with a single sentence. The clause is enforceable and active. She did not respond again. Later that week, Daniel uncovered another layer. There's a scheduled meeting with an immigration attorney in Vancouver next Monday, he said. It's still on the calendar. He won't attend. I said. Why are you so sure? Daniel asked. Because he can't move capital, I replied, and immigration pathways require proof of liquid assets. Brian was pacing again that night. I can fix this, he said suddenly. Fix what? I asked. The optics. The trust. We can renegotiate. I repeated softly. He stopped pacing. You don't want to destroy everything, he said. I looked around the house, the kitchen island where we once reviewed investments, the staircase where I overheard the first lie. You destroyed trust, I said evenly. I'm protecting assets. He fell silent. For the first time since Thanksgiving. He looked uncertain. Not angry. Not defensive. Uncertain. He had believed he controlled geography. He had believed distance would shield him. Now every account was frozen. Every structure under review. Every ally questioned. And for the first time, he realized relocation without liquidity was just a fantasy. He had planned to leave quietly. Instead, he was stuck in the house he thought he was escaping, watching every door close in real time. The evidentiary hearing was scheduled for 9:30 on a cold December morning. Brian barely spoke during the drive downtown. The courthouse in Seattle felt sterile and impersonal. But to me it felt precise. Controlled. Structured. The opposite of the chaos he had tried to create. Laura met us outside the courtroom. Calm and prepared. Disclosure deadline passed last night, she said quietly. His attorney filed partial compliance. Partial. Inside the courtroom, Brian sat rigidly beside his lawyer, a man I had never met before this week. His expression was tight, defensive, but no longer confident. The judge entered, and the room rose. Laura presented first. She laid out the timeline cleanly. Joint liquidity conversion, LLC transfers, Vancouver holding company formation, immigration inquiry, lease application, accelerated transfer attempt. She referenced the fraud and concealment asset reversal provision. She did not mention Brittany's name at first. Brian's attorney argued business expansion, cross-border opportunity. No formal divorce filing had occurred at the time of the transfers. Intent, he implied, was speculative. Laura responded evenly. Intent is inferred from pattern and concealment, she said, and from documented coordination with a third party tied directly to the beneficiary entity. The judge leaned forward. Is there evidence of non-disclosure? He asked. Laura handed up a document. The digital signature authorization for the home equity conversion. Attached was the IP address metadata. Not our home network, not my office. A foreign endpoint. The judge studied it silently. Brian's attorney whispered urgently to him. Then Laura introduced the final piece. Trust bypass _outline. PDF. Brian's shoulders stiffened visibly. The document outlined a phased relocation strategy contingent on shielding marital assets prior to initiating divorce. It included bullet points referencing post-holiday separation conversation. The judge's expression shifted. Mr. Callahan, he said directly to Brian. Were these funds repositioned in anticipation of marital dissolution? Brian hesitated. His lawyer leaned toward him. Answer the question. The judge repeated. It was a business contingency, Brian said finally. Did your spouse know of the relocation plan? The judge asked. Silence. No, Brian admitted quietly. The words settled heavily in the room. Laura stepped forward again. Under the executed post-nuptial agreement, concealment of marital assets tied to pre-dissolution repositioning triggers, reversal. Disclosure. and potential penalty allocation, she said. The judge nodded slowly. I am extending the asset freeze, he ruled. Full disclosure required within 72 hours. Failure to comply will result in contempt proceedings. Brian's face went pale. Outside the courtroom, Brittany was waiting. I hadn't expected her to appear. She stood near the hallway windows, coat wrapped tightly around her. This is escalating unnecessarily, she said as soon as she saw me. It escalated when you helped him move our money, I replied calmly. I didn't know the clause was active. She insisted. You didn't ask, I said. She looked past me at Brian, who was speaking tensely with his attorney. This could destroy him, she said quietly. He calculated that risk. I answered. Brian approached us moments later. What do you want? He demanded again. Full disclosure, I said. You're making it impossible to fix this privately, he snapped. I tried private, I replied. You chose secret. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration spilling over. You're enjoying this? He accused. No, I said steadily. I'm ending it. Back at the house that night, the silence felt heavier. Brian opened his laptop and began compiling financial statements under court order. Foreign accounts, LLC ledgers, trust distribution memos. I watched from across the room. He was no longer orchestrating. He was complying. Daniel called late in the evening. They found additional transfers routed through a secondary consulting agreement, he said. Small amounts, but consistent. How long? I asked. 4 months. 4 months. Longer than I had even realized. When Brian closed his laptop near midnight, he looked exhausted. This didn't have to go this far, he said quietly. Yes, I replied. It did. He stared at me, searching for something, regret, softness, doubt. He found none. You never trusted me, he said finally. I trusted documentation, I answered. He laughed bitterly. You're going to take everything. No, I said calmly. I'm reclaiming what was mine. The next morning, Laura emailed confirmation. Full disclosure deadline acknowledged. Additional accounts identified. The Vancouver Investor Pathway application had been officially suspended due to insufficient accessible capital. Immigration without liquidity was meaningless. Brittany's holding company was now listed in the court record as a related entity subject to inquiry. Brian sat at the kitchen island staring at his phone. What happens now? He asked quietly. Now, I said. We proceed with divorce. The word hung between us like something inevitable. He had planned to file first. He had planned to control timing. Instead, he was responding to motions I had already set in motion weeks earlier. He believed distance would protect him. He believed silence meant ignorance. He believed I wouldn't act. Now every structure he built was under oath, and every plan he drafted was evidence. The divorce petition was filed the next morning at 8:17. I didn't tell Brian beforehand. He found out when his attorney called. I was in my office reviewing client portfolios when my phone buzzed with a short message from him. You filed? Yes, I replied. He didn't respond for several minutes. When he came home that evening, he looked different. Not angry, not defensive. Just smaller. You couldn't wait, he asked quietly. For what? I replied. For me to explain. You explained? I said. In bullet points. He didn't argue. Laura had structured the filing carefully. Fraudulent concealment. Dissipation of marital assets. Breach of fiduciary duty within marriage. Invocation of the fraud and concealment asset reversal provision. We weren't asking for drama. We were asking for redistribution. Daniel's forensic report was nearly complete. The layering pattern was now fully mapped. Joint funds to LLC to Vancouver Holding Company. Secondary disbursements labeled consulting fees. Mortgage liquidity line used as collateral buffer. 4 months of coordination. 2 weeks of acceleration. 3 days of collapse. Brian spent that night reviewing documents with his attorney over video call in his locked office. I stayed downstairs, organizing my own files. The house no longer felt shared. It felt transitional. 2 days later, Brittany issued a formal affidavit denying intentional involvement in concealment. She claimed she believed the transfers were business-related and that Brian had represented his marital situation as amicably separable. Amicably separable. Laura forwarded the affidavit to me. "She's protecting herself," she said. "But her communications are discoverable." Discoverable. That afternoon, Daniel uncovered another detail. The Vancouver lease deposit originated from the same LLC account that received the home equity transfer, he said. "There's no separation between business and marital funds." Clear enough. Brian's attorney requested mediation. "Litigation will be expensive," he told me over speakerphone. "Public. Damaging. Transparency is already public," I replied. "We can negotiate settlement." He pressed. "We will," I said calmly, "with full disclosure." That evening, Brian sat across from me at the kitchen island again. "This isn't about money anymore," he said. "It always was," I answered. He exhaled sharply. "You're punishing me." "No," I said. "I'm enforcing a contract." He looked at me carefully. "You planned for this," he said. "I planned for risk," I replied. He laughed bitterly. "You really think you won?" I considered the question. "This isn't about winning," I said quietly. "It's about not losing." The preliminary mediation session took place the following week. Laura presented the forensic accounting summary clearly. Total marital asset exposure. Attempted cross-border repositioning. Lease commitment in Vancouver. Immigration capital documentation. Trust amendment coordination. Brian's attorney proposed a split that preserved a portion of the foreign holding structure in exchange for accelerated divorce terms. Laura declined immediately. "Concealment triggers reversal," she said. "Full accounting first." Brian leaned back in his chair. Frustrated. "You're destroying everything," he said. "No," I replied evenly. "You miscalculated everything." The mediator paused the session. Outside the conference room, Brian approached me privately. "You could have come with me," he said suddenly. "To Vancouver?" I asked. "To start over. With money you hid from me," I replied. He had no answer. Back inside, Laura requested judicial review of the trust amendment's impact on marital allocation. The judge scheduled a supplemental hearing. The trust, once untouchable, was now under scrutiny because of timing. Timing had become everything. That night, I began sorting personal items into boxes. Not in anger. In clarity, the house would likely be sold. The equity redistributed under court order. The mortgage liquidity line reversed and accounted for. Brian watched me from the doorway. "You're really leaving?" he said quietly. "Yes," I replied. He leaned against the frame. "I didn't think you'd fight this hard. I didn't think you'd underestimate me," I answered. The following morning, Laura called again. "The judge is inclined to enforce the concealment clause fully," she said. "If the pattern holds under final review, penalty allocation may apply." Penalty allocation, not revenge. Consequence. Brian spent the rest of the week compiling every document the court requested. Foreign account statements, lease contracts, immigration correspondence. Each submission narrowed his leverage. Brittany's communications were formally subpoenaed. Her Vancouver holding company was flagged for judicial examination. International relocation without liquid capital had collapsed. When Brian sat across from me that Sunday night, he looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before. "You've made your point," he said. "It wasn't a point," I replied. "It was a boundary." He stared at the table. "What happens to us?" he asked quietly. "There is no us," I said. For the first time, he didn't argue. He had planned to exit quietly after Thanksgiving. Instead, he was still here, boxed in by documents he thought I'd never read. He believed distance would solve betrayal. He never understood that accountability travels faster than relocation. The final hearing was scheduled 3 days before Christmas. Seattle was wrapped in gray skies and cold rain, the kind that made everything feel suspended between seasons. Brian and I arrived separately this time. He looked thinner, not physically, but structurally, like something essential had been removed. Inside the courtroom, Laura organized her files with the same calm precision she had maintained from the beginning. Daniel sat behind us, prepared to clarify any forensic detail the judge might question. Brian's attorney opened with a plea for proportionality. While there was poor judgment, he said carefully, there was no completed relocation, no finalized transfer beyond recovery, and no formal filing at the time of asset movement. Laura stood. Intent does not require completion, she said evenly. The concealment clause is triggered by deliberate non-disclosure of material financial repositioning in anticipation of dissolution. She submitted the final forensic summary. Total marital funds repositioned or attempted to be repositioned. Mortgage liquidity exposure. Lease commitments in Vancouver. Immigration capital documentation. Trust amendment coordination within weeks of transfers. The judge reviewed everything in silence. Then he addressed Brian directly. Did you disclose these transfers to your spouse prior to initiating relocation planning? No, Brian said quietly. Did you intend to inform her before filing for divorce? Brian hesitated. No. The word landed heavily. The judge nodded once. The concealment provision in the post-nuptial agreement is clear, he said. The pattern demonstrates intent to shield marital assets prior to dissolution. Accordingly, the court enforces reversal and penalty allocation under the agreement. Laura's hand rested lightly on the table beside me. I didn't move. The ruling continued. Full reversal of transferred funds. Additional compensatory allocation to Rebecca under the concealment clause. Responsibility for legal fees assigned primarily to Brian due to breach of fiduciary obligation. The Vancouver holding company flagged for cooperative disclosure with Canadian authorities if necessary. The trust amendment subject to limited judicial review regarding timing but not invalidated entirely. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't theatrical. It was exact. Outside the courtroom, Brian stood silently beside his attorney. Brittany was not present this time. Her affidavit had been incorporated into the record, but her physical absence felt like quiet retreat. Brian approached me slowly. So that's it, he said. Yes, I replied. You're satisfied. I considered the word. This wasn't about satisfaction, I said. It was about structure. He looked at me for a long moment. I thought you'd be emotional, he admitted. I said softly. Before I started reading, he almost smiled at that. What are you going to do now? He asked. I'm moving, I replied. Downtown. Smaller place. Clean title. He nodded. And me, you're free, I said evenly. Free without liquidity. Free without relocation capital. Free without the trust adjustment he believed would carry him through. Back at the house. The finality settled in quietly. The real estate listing had already gone live. Showings were scheduled for after the holidays. The equity would be divided per court order. Adjusted for reversal and penalty allocation. Brian packed slowly. Not angrily. Just methodically. At one point, he paused in the hallway. You never yelled, he said. I didn't need to, I replied. You never cried. Not where you could see. He absorbed that. On Christmas Eve, we signed the final property disclosure documents. He stood at the kitchen island, the same place where he once asked me to authorize a tax optimization. You always read everything, he said quietly. Yes, I replied. He let out a breath that sounded almost like regret. I thought silence meant ignorance, he said. Silence means timing, I answered. He left that evening with 2 suitcases and a duffel bag. No Vancouver flight. No lease activation. The immigration pathway had expired without accessible funds. Brittany's holding company had quietly restructured its director listings weeks earlier. I watched from the doorway as Brian loaded his car. There was no shouting. No final confrontation. Just the quiet recognition of consequences. when his car disappeared at the end of the street. The house felt still. Not empty. Reset. I walked back inside and stood in the center of the living room. This had never been about revenge. It had been about documentation, structure, and refusing to be erased from my own life. He thought I didn't know. He thought I wouldn't act. He thought geography would protect him. What he never understood was that contracts don't expire just because you stop paying attention to them. And neither do boundaries. I signed the final divorce decree on a quiet January morning. There was no dramatic soundtrack, no courtroom applause, no moment of visible triumph. Just a pen gliding across paper and a judge's clerk stamping the document with efficient indifference. Rebecca Callahan. Restored to Rebecca Mercer. The name felt steady in my hand. The house in Magnolia sold within 3 weeks. The market was strong. And the equity, recalculated under the court's enforcement of the concealment clause, was distributed exactly as ordered. The reversed transfers returned to the marital pool before division. The penalty allocation shifted a larger portion to me, along with the majority of legal fees. Not as revenge, as enforcement. Brian didn't contest the final numbers. By then, there was nothing left to contest. The Vancouver lease had been terminated quietly. The immigration file closed for insufficient capital verification. Brittany's holding company amended its public filings, removing Brian as any form of strategic partner. Strategic. That word had cost him everything. I moved into a smaller condo downtown overlooking Elliott Bay. Clean title. Single owner. No shared mortgage line. No hidden liquidity conversions. The first night I slept there, the silence felt different from the silence in the old house. It wasn't tension. It was space. I set up my desk by the window, organized my files, updated my client disclosures. I didn't hide the divorce. I didn't dramatize it either. When clients asked, I answered calmly. It was a structural adjustment. I would say, and that was true. 3 weeks after the decree, Brian called. I almost didn't answer. Hey, he said when I picked up. His voice sounded flatter, quieter. I just wanted to say, you were right, he said. About what? I asked. Documentation, he replied. I didn't respond immediately. I thought I was smarter than the system. He continued. Smarter than timing. I wasn't. No, I said softly. You just underestimated risk. There was a long pause. I never thought you'd fight like that, he admitted. I wasn't fighting. I said, I was protecting. He let out a breath. Are you happy? He asked. The question surprised me. I'm stable, I answered. And stability, for me, has always been a form of happiness. After we hung up, I stood by the window and watched the ferries cross the water. This story isn't about winning. It's about not signing your name blindly. It's about reading every clause, every amendment, every subtle shift in behavior. It's about understanding that betrayal rarely begins with emotion. It begins with paperwork. He thought silence meant I didn't know. He thought calm meant I wouldn't act. He thought geography would shield him. What he never understood is that trust is not blind faith. It is informed consent. And when consent is manipulated, contracts speak louder than arguments. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I didn't chase him to Vancouver. I waited. I documented. I acted when timing aligned. That was the real power. If you've ever felt that quiet suspicion in your gut, if you've ever been told you were overthinking when the numbers didn't add up, if you've ever signed something because you trusted the person across the table more than the paper in front of you, pause. Read again. Ask questions. And never underestimate the strength of a woman who understands her own finances. Because revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's filed. Sometimes it's notarized. Sometimes it's served at 11:45 on Thanksgiving morning. I didn't celebrate when it ended. I reorganized. I rebuilt. I reclaimed. And I moved forward without needing anyone's permission. If this story resonated with you, if you believe silence can be strength and knowledge can be power, Stay with me. There are more stories like this. Stories about betrayal, hidden clauses, family drama, inheritance disputes, and the quiet moments when the tables turn. If you've ever faced something similar, share your thoughts in the comments. I read them. I respect them. And sometimes, your story might help another woman realize she's not alone. And if you want to hear more stories where hidden truths surface and justice unfolds slowly but surely, subscribe and stay connected. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't destruction, it's documentation. And the courage to use it. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.